Good morning. So I'm Kasey Moss. I'm a family psychiatrist, so I see the lifespan, and pretty much every person that I'm working with, I'm thinking about them in the context of their family. I'm also the medical director for our local mental health community clinics, and then I just took on a new role, which I'm really excited about, as the well-being medical director for the coastal region, so really supporting providers from mid-coast all the way up. All right, so I don't have any disclosures. I don't have any financial disclosures. I do have a disclosure. I'm so passionate about this topic, and I get sometimes a little emotional, and we'll show a clip later. I might cry. Like I just get so moved by it. So, and it's okay if you cry too. This whole topic kind of just brings me back, I think, to that like angst of adolescence. And I actually had a fairly charmed adolescence. Like I did well in school and I had friends, and it was still just like such an emotional and painful time. So anyway, just wanted to say I might cry. If you cry too, I see you. All right, so these are our objectives. So we're going to go into the etiologies of emotional dysregulation. So really understanding kind of, it's such a broad concept, and there are a lot of different conditions that can result in emotional dysregulation. And then how it presents in different settings. We'll look at kind of like the developmental contributors to emotional dysregulation, and then review some of the biopsychosocial treatment approaches. We're also going to do an experiment. So the pie plates are not part of breakfast, so just wait on that and we'll get to it. All right. So Dr. Tweed had mentioned this in his presentation as well. So the president of ACAP, which is the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, really pushed towards having a focus on emotional dysregulation in children and adolescents, because I'm sure everyone is here for a reason. This is becoming more and more of an issue. But I just want to point out, emotional dysregulation is normal on its own. It's not pathologic, right? We all get emotionally dysregulated. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to use a term, severe emotional dysregulation, and you'll see it abbreviated as SED. So I just want to make sure we're really making that distinction, because it's totally normal to have emotional dysregulation, right? So we're talking about like really severe impairing emotional dysregulation. So what Dr. Carlson, the president of ACAP, had said was that she likened these kind of outbursts to the sequence of events that culminate in one to a bomb. And I really liked that concept. So there are these different triggers that kind of light the fuse. So it's low frustration tolerance, having an abnormal threat sensitivity, and cognitive inflexibility. And I feel like those are the three areas that I see across the board really contributing to folks having significant emotional dysregulation. And then it's often due to anger or distress. So this is a long list of different diagnoses that commonly have severe emotional dysregulation. And we're going to go and break down each one. Before we talk about that, I just want to bring up this concept, because you'll see it throughout this talk, this concept of lagging skills. So Ross Greene wrote a book, The Explosive Child. I recommend this to parents. I have had parents come back and say, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. And often where I bring this up is parents who, with really good intentions, are coming in saying, I have tried every consequence in the book, and my kid is still out of control. And it gives me an opportunity to talk with them about the fact that consequences aren't an effective way of changing behavior, right? Like boundaries, that's a different thing, but consequences. So if I say, if you don't get your homework done, I'm going to take away your video games. If you have a child who isn't able to complete that homework, you are not going to get them to do the homework, right? All you're really going to do is you're going to make them feel ashamed because they can't do their homework, and very angry because you took away their video game, right? And so this concept of kind of, lagging skills is that challenging behavior occurs when the demands and expectations being placed on children, I would say on anyone, exceed the kid's capacity to respond adaptively. And an example I like to think about this, because I'm always trying to think about this in the context of myself, so maybe I'm a little egocentric, but at the end of my training fellowship, COVID had hit, and we were being told that we were going to be redeployed to the critical care unit. And I lost it. Like I was crying at work. I was terrified. And it wasn't because I didn't want to go to the critical care unit. It was because I had literally never intubated a patient, with the exception of it being in a very controlled situation with the support of an attending next to me. And I went and catastrophized to this place where I was going to be in a situation where the demands and expectations were way beyond the skill set that I had. And all I could imagine was I was going to kill someone. And I think it was the most dysregulated I've ever been in the workplace, ever. Luckily, that didn't happen. But so I just want to point out that this is normal. This isn't unique to children, right? Like when we're in situations where the demands are just not realistic, we're not our best selves. And that happens for kids. The difference was I could go to someone and say, I am so scared right now that I might hurt somebody in the critical care unit. A 14-year-old doesn't have the skill set to be able to even articulate that this phenomenon is happening. So this is a great book. I love this model. All right, so ADHD. So here's the DSM-5 criteria for ADHD. And what I think is really interesting about it is there's really no mention of severe emotional dysregulation. But I think we can all agree that kids with ADHD have severe emotional dysregulation, right? And so what I tell parents, because they're like, they're so moody, I think that they might have bipolar disorder. And I say, actually, their internal experience isn't really that different than the rest of ours, but they're emotionally impulsive. So what that looks like is they have a feeling and they can't hit the brakes on erupting, right? And so that's how severe emotional dysregulation can present for ADHD. So again, when demands are out of proportion to skill. So I heard this statistic. I don't know, like I don't have a resource for this, so please don't ask me. But I have heard a mentor of mine say that ADHD patients get corrective feedback like 10-1 compared to their peers. I bet it's higher. Like think about the things that get said to people with ADHD, like, why can't you be like your brother? Put your stuff away. How come you're always losing your water bottle? Where'd that mouth guard go? Like it's just non-stop, right? That would make me feel pretty angry. So at home, where this can pop up is during times of transitions, like families often talk about that morning routine and the evening routine. And I think that's a combination of those are often times where medications haven't yet kicked in or have already worn off. But those are also times in the day where the whole family is pretty stressed. I don't know about you, but getting out the door with my 3 kids is like I snuck out for this presentation and was like, good luck. So, you know, those morning transitions and evening routines, people are tired, people are hungry, and there's so much executive functioning required. And oftentimes I think even with our teenagers, we expect them to have this concept of time that I don't think that they have yet. When we're like, we gotta go, right? Doing homework, again, like if that's a skill set that they really struggle with, and they're being expected to just kind of sit there and do the homework. The thing about having ADHD, it's really not about inattention. It's about not being able to focus effectively, right? And that's a little different. So what I like to give, for example, for parents is I don't have ADHD. So right now, I can pay attention to this, I can pay attention to you, and if a bear walked through this door, I would be very aware of it, right? For folks with ADHD, it's all in or all out. So I'm distracted by Dr. Tweed, and now I've missed the bear, which is anxiety provoking, or I'm focusing on the door, and now I've missed that his hand is up and he has a question for me, right? And so that's incredibly anxiety provoking. So kids with ADHD often talk about how it's nice to just have someone who will sit next to them while they do their homework. They're kind of protecting their blind side, right? And so if you are expecting your teenager to just kind of sit down and do their homework, they're not able to articulate, hey, can you protect my blind side, right? So how does that show up? Frustration and anger with the constant kind of corrective feedback. Non-preferred activities or unexpected changes. At school, I think especially when expected to sit still quietly for long periods of time, you know, sometimes we think a little bit more about like younger kids for this, but even teenagers, I would say adults. This is why you guys, we're going to do an experiment later. We're going to watch a video, like 90 minutes of listening to me talk. I don't know how you could possibly do that. So I think that's a big part where there's just like this energy that builds up and people get frustrated. when executive functioning skills are expected and the kid can't meet that demand. And then when symptoms interfere with social relationships, I see this a lot. So especially as you start getting into high school, so some of that like class clown behavior when kids are really little, it's kind of socially accepted or maybe even preferred. So I've got a bit of a class clown, my oldest kid right now, and he'll admit to me like, I do things that are so frustrating for my teacher because I really want to be liked and my friends think it's hilarious. So that starts to be less acceptable when you get into those high school grades, right? And so then you're having this kind of irritability pop up because kids are starting to feel really like ashamed and left out because like their blurting behavior is really interfering with their ability to connect with their peers. Let's move on to something called DMDD. So we're going to go in a little bit of a history lesson here. So there was a period of time where there was a big push to identify kids as having pediatric bipolar disorder. And what we really learned from that time was that we weren't really seeing pediatric bipolar disorder. We were seeing something else. And it was a lot of kids that had these kinds of what they were calling like mood swings. But it was really more of like having this like persistent kind of irritability and then having a big outburst, which is very different than having depressive and manic episodes. And that kids with this kind of cluster of symptoms into adulthood did not develop bipolar. They were more like depressed and anxious. So that's kind of where this came from, this diagnosis to describe these kinds of kids, because a lot of children were inappropriately getting prescribed atypical antipsychotics. And what's really unfortunate is that a lot of those studies were being funded by Johnson & Johnson, who make risperidone. And so it's been kind of a bit of a controversy and frankly a dark time in child psychiatry. So again, this is, if you think about this on a graph, like these kids are kind of persistently like grumpy and irritable, and then they have these like big outbursts. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't see a lot of kids with this diagnosis that don't have comorbid trauma. And maybe it's not big T trauma, right? Like significant kind of sexual or physical life-threatening abuse, but maybe some of that more like micro trauma. Again, this is going to present in places where demands are out of proportion to the skills. And this is going to show with like really pervasive low frustration tolerance. It's going to be with grown-ups, it's going to be with peers, it's going to be at home, and it's going to be in school. Autism, these are the criteria for ASD. Again, you'll see kind of on number 5, there's the mention of extreme distress, which remember Dr. Carlson talked about that being in the etiology of severe emotional dysregulation. But you can see a lot of different symptoms here that could lead to emotional dysregulation. Again, this is when demands are out of proportion to skills. It happens at home and at school. I think during times of transitions are really hard for kids with autism, and unexpected changes. That's what parents really tell me a lot is we don't even tell our child that we have this potential plan until we know for sure we're doing it. Because if we say this is a possibility and then it doesn't happen, there's a huge eruption. And I try to work with families on allowing there to be some distress sometimes so that they can practice skills, right? But it's a balance. And when you say that to parents who are like running a household and have other children, they're like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, but it's good to have a little bit of distress so you can practice skills, right? Misunderstanding social cues with grown-ups as well as with siblings and peers. This is really common. Social communication difficulty is one of the kind of hallmark symptoms of autism. And again, you can imagine like if somebody says we maybe are going to go to the playground today and they're kind of missing that like the social kind of pragmatics behind that, and then they can get really upset. Or the way that this presents with just difficulty maintaining relationships. You know, there's that spectrum. I almost feel like this is harder. Like when you have a child with autism who's really impaired, I think it's easier to see why this would be popping up and support them. I think when we have kids who are what we consider kind of less impaired, we still have to remember they still struggle with these things. And then when overstimulated, so that's another part of the diagnosis is that they're both hyper and hypo-reactive to sensory stimulation. So loud noises, or just noises, right, that might seem really loud to them can make them get really upset. PTSD, there are so many criteria for PTSD in the DSM, but I just kind of highlighted some of the ones that you could imagine would have emotional dysregulation. So that physical reactivity, that like hypervigilance, inappropriate threat sensitivity like we talked about earlier. Risky or destructive behavior is a symptom of PTSD. Like, I don't think we think about these when we're really looking at the diagnosis. Where this is going to show up, again, the theme here, when the demands are out of proportion to skills. At home, particularly if they continue to be exposed to trauma. And I think that we have a lot of kids who live in home environments that, again, it's not big T trauma, it's not CPS report trauma, right? But we can all agree that there are some pretty significant attachment traumas, those kinds of things going on in the home. And so when they continue to be exposed to that environment, how could they not be emotionally dysregulated, right? And then if their grown-up reminds them or their siblings remind them of the trauma, either by, you might have an older brother that reminds you of your stepfather or, father who was abusive. That's going to reactivate some of that emotional dysregulation. And again, that hypervigilance is just, notorious for when you're on edge, you're more prone to being emotionally dysregulated. At school, I think a lot of kids, especially teenagers, talk about feeling like they're out of control, like not having autonomy. That's that power struggle that people get into at school, right? Being told what to do. And again, I think sometimes we look at that as like teenagers being just like misbehaving or whatever you want to call it, but that's human nature. Like if I was like, we're going to do this talk, and then all of a sudden I said, okay, now we're going to go run 3 miles outside as part of this presentation. I don't know many people who would be like, yeah, that sounds great, right? But we do that to teenagers all the time. So difficulty concentrating, so PTSD can really affect your cognitive function. And then just feeling really negative about oneself or about the world in general can lead to this emotional dysregulation. Borderline personality disorder, so difficulty controlling anger is one of the criteria. I think the other one that can really present with severe emotional dysregulation is impulsivity, kind of going back to that, not having the executive functioning to just put the brakes on the big eruptions that they have. And this will show up in a lot of different ways. I think at home, certainly conflict with their grown-ups or with their siblings. A lot of that has to do with pretty ineffective communication styles. Constant contact with peers through social media. So again, with borderline personality disorder, a lot of the kind of big feelings happen in the setting of interpersonal conflict or rejection. When I was a kid, MySpace had maybe just started around my junior or senior year of high school, and you could not have a Facebook account without a college email address. So I was so lucky because I was really not affected by this. Our teenagers are now bombarded by these kinds of conflicts 24/7. And then boredom and emptiness. So that's another symptom criteria of borderline personality disorder is that feeling bored or empty frequently. And so some kids tell me they would prefer to be severely emotionally dysregulated because it actually makes them feel something, because that feeling of emptiness and boredom is so intolerable. I love when kids have the insight to be able to share that with me. At school, again, that hypersensitivity to rejection, they experience it from grown-ups and peers. There is so much stigma with borderline personality disorder, and our patients know it, right? And so when they have this diagnosis or they have this kind of cluster of symptoms, they pick up on the fact that other people are frustrated with them or don't like them, can't root for them, right? I don't know how you could be emotionally regulated when that's the environment that you're living in. When their symptoms interfere with academic success, so I think there are a lot of our teenagers who might have this condition, they're maybe not yet diagnosed, and academically they actually do just fine, but they get placed in resource rooms. They get placed in different classrooms, right? They're not in those mainstream classrooms. They're in, it's not quite special education, but it's for the emotionally disturbed, although the language in schools has changed, thank goodness. It's now, what is it now? Ooh, it's not emotionally disturbed. I think it's emotional disorder is the language in an IEP now, which is better than emotionally disturbed. Anyway, so projection identification or kind of that self-fulfilling prophecy, this is really common for borderline personality disorder. And that is when you essentially are kind of, I've got it figured out. Dr. Tweed does not like me, and he is not rooting for me. And then I start to behave in ways that make it really hard for him to root for me. And he's trying. He's really trying. But you know, I do things like just have a horrible presentation on emotional dysregulation in adolescence. And then he starts treating me in a way that I get to say, aha, I knew it. He's not rooting for me, right? So this is a really, really tough dynamic that kids get into with treatment providers, with teachers, with their parents, and that can lead to a lot of emotional dysregulation. ODD, this should have been another disclosure. I am really just not a fan of this diagnosis. I'm just not a fan. What really bothers me about this diagnosis is that young men of color are more likely to have this diagnosis than ADHD, than their white female peers. So that is such a problem, right? So I just think when we talk about stigma, holy smokes, there's a lot of stigma. So this is really a lot of, losing your temper, easily annoyed, resentful, argues with authority figures. I could see so many other conditions making sense of this cluster of symptoms. And so there's actually a push right now. I'm on the, in my spare time, the assembly to the American Psychiatric Association, and there's actually a push right now to get PTSD as exclusionary criteria for this condition, because it's not currently. So you have to be able to say this isn't, made better sense by a psychotic, substance use, depressive, or bipolar disorder. But there's actually a push to try to get PTSD on that exclusionary criteria as well, to really get people to be thinking more about, is this a trauma response versus calling something ODD? Because there's so much stigma with ODD. There's something else that I wanted to say about that.
Does it qualify for special ed? Yeah.
It doesn't qualify for special ed. Oh, that's so unfortunate. So I don't love this. I remove it a lot, to be honest. And then this would show up kind of pervasively in all settings. I also wonder a lot about, are we misdiagnosing a learning disability? If you can't learn and you are kind of borderline low IQ, the world is an incredibly frustrating place. So anyway, I don't love it. Moving on. So bipolar disorder, not common in childhood, but certainly can start presenting in adolescence, and I've absolutely seen that. So typically I think what we see is it starts off as more like having a history of depressive episodes. I start to worry about this when I have kind of like a difficult to treat depression sitting in front of me. Is this going to be more of like bipolar disorder, or I even have a couple of kids I'm right now worried about like a prodromal primary psychotic illness. But this is the criteria for a manic episode. So certainly you can have irritability with a depressive episode, but I think mania is where we really see big emotional dysregulation. So this irritability can show with depressive episodes, and especially like mixed manic episodes. So that's where you still have the kind of increased energy of a manic episode, but your mood isn't euphoric. It's actually pretty dysphoric, and that people are very grumpy during those times. So I just want to, substance use, this is obviously such a problem for our adolescents. Although I think there are some studies coming out saying that this generation is maybe using less substances and also having engaging in sexual activity less than previous generations, which is really promising, but nonetheless still an issue. So you can have irritability and severe emotional dysregulation both with the intoxication of a substance, so like stimulants, methamphetamines, cocaine, but also with withdrawal. And that's a really important part that I try to talk with parents and kids about, is obviously withdrawal from alcohol, opioids. When you're withdrawing from opioids, you literally feel like you're gonna die. It is a horrible experience. But cannabis, you can get a pretty significant irritability when you're withdrawing from cannabis. So when I talk to people about how I think their cannabis use is maybe making their mental health symptoms worse, they say, but when I stop it, I feel worse. And I say, absolutely, that's withdrawal. Push through it and then you'll feel better. And then the other thing that's different, I think, with substance use and maybe some of the other conditions we've talked about is by nature of the use, there's so much trouble that they get into, right? Either with their parents or at school or with the law. And so there's a lot of shame and guilt when you're feeling like you're in trouble. All right, so let's shift a little bit to really thinking about developmental considerations for all teenagers. So this isn't just with a specific condition, but just all teenagers in general. So this is Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. Have you guys seen this before? Yeah. So the role of the teenager is really figuring out their identity, versus role confusion. So that's where they're at. And what does that mean? So again, even for just a typically developing teenager without any psychiatric conditions, it's a really challenging time. Like, they're navigating these social relationships, they're trying to figure out who they are. So the conflict is their identity versus their role confusion. And then the basic virtue is fidelity, and then important events are social relationships. And I'll talk about this again at the end, but sometimes parents get upset when their teenagers are valuing their relationships with their friends more than they are with their family. And I'm like, yes, like, that's great. That's developmentally appropriate. That means your kid is on track. And somebody remind me of this conversation when my children become teenagers, because it will be a hard time. So if you don't successfully navigate this developmental stage, you can continue to have role confusion. And I think we can all think of some teenagers and some adults that probably struggled with this phase in their life. So some of the consequences that can happen with not going through this developmental stage successfully is difficulties with commitment. Having a stable personal identity allows individuals to have better relationships with others, and it can affect mental health and well-being. You have this weak sense of self, and then you really lack confidence. Okay. So before we watch this video, this is Inside Out 2, so if you haven't seen it, I'm sorry. This will be a spoiler for you. If you need to walk out and come back in, that's fine. So just a little bit of background. So we know Riley from Inside Out. She had a really tough move. She cried in the middle of her classroom, right? It was a really, really tough time for her. That was when she was in childhood. Now she's starting to approach adolescence. And the background here is that she's trying out for this really important hockey team. Her friends are going to be moving to a different school. She is so nervous about this that she broke into her coach's hotel room and looked in the files to see what the coach had said about her. Now, this is not a child with ODD or conduct disorder, right? But she's breaking and entering into a locked file to get this information because she is so determined to do well. This is so important to her. And what she sees is under her name, not ready. So this is like the context leading up to this next scene.
Come on! I'm not good enough! You have to score!
Anderson, penalty box, 2 minutes.
No! Grace, are you okay? Oh, Grace! It all happened so fast, I didn't even see her. I'm not good enough. Oh no, what did I do? No. I can fix it, I'm not good enough. Come on, Riley, get it together. Come on, Riley, get it together. I'm not good enough. You have to score, Riley! Or they do all of the things for now. You're putting too much pressure on her. You don't get to choose who Riley is. Anxiety? You need to let her go. I'm a good person. I'm sorry. I was just trying to protect her. But you're right. We don't get to choose who Riley is.
All right, so there's more. So one thing that I didn't talk about actually is anxiety, right? So that's another condition where it can be really common for kids to have severe emotional dysregulation. And what I think I love about this movie is that they show that putting back that old sense of self, that's her childhood sense of self that Joy puts back on the little thing there, it's not enough. It doesn't stop the anxiety attack. Just telling herself or them just telling her she's good enough isn't what fixes the problem. So then let's go to what happens next.
I'm a good person. What are you doing? I'm selfish. I'm kind. I'm not good enough. I'm a good person. I need to fit in. But I want to be myself. I'm brave. But I get scared. Success is I make mistakes. I'm nice. I'm mean. I'm a good friend. I'm a terrible friend. I'm strong. I need help sometimes.
All right. Whew, I didn't cry. I will say the first time that I watched this, I was sobbing on the couch. This is such a beautiful example of the developmental task of adolescence, right? Integrating all the different parts of yourself. And when you can't do that for a variety of different reasons, life is so challenging, right? I wish everybody could experience that kind of integration that Riley gets to experience. So then you see her later on and she's like repaired with her friends and she's playing hockey and she's mastered the task and, you know, feeling great. So I would love for Inside Out to do like an Inside Out 3 when Riley has like a baby and is postpartum and is like losing it again, maybe. So, all right. So let's move on to treatment. So, you know, I really love to conceptualize treatment in the context of kind of like a biopsychosocial treatment, right? So these are some of the different domains within those 3 different categories and how some of them overlap. So when we think about bio, I mean, I'm thinking mostly about medications when I think about this, but I think there are a lot of other things too, right? Like nutrition and exercise and, you know, vitamin deficiencies and all of that kind of stuff. So that's important too. But I just wanted to kind of highlight I probably could have made a slide for every single one of these conditions to talk about the different medications you can use to treat, but I wanted to focus on some of the other psychosocial treatments. So for ADHD, stimulants, alpha agonists usually are what we're using. There are some non-stimulant options like Strattera. I sometimes use Wellbutrin for some of my older kids with comorbid depression and ADHD, especially if I'm worried about substance use either from the kid or from the parent. DMDD, like there really aren't any specific medications, but I think we all just have tried some of the SSRIs. Again, if you're thinking about it as kind of like almost like a prodrome, right, to depression and anxiety, and SSRI might be helpful there. I use a lot of alpha agonists in this population. I think avoiding atypical antipsychotics at all costs, like this is a real problem. Kids get on these medications for severe outbursts, and it is effective to a degree because it's essentially sedating, and then you have this like really awful metabolic syndrome that develops. For autism, there are 2 FDA-approved medications for agitation associated with autism, and that's risperidone and Abilify. I tend to try to use Abilify just because it has less of a metabolic syndrome, but it still has it. It's not. It doesn't not happen, right? But less likely than risperidone. And then if there's a comorbid anxiety or depressive disorder, then you would use an SSRI. And then again, if there's a comorbid ADHD, then you could use stimulants or alpha agonists. For PTSD, some of the alpha agonists. So when I say alpha agonists, I'm referring to clonidine and guanfacine. Some SSRIs can be helpful for PTSD. Borderline personality disorder. The more medication someone with borderline personality disorder takes, the worse their clinical symptoms are. And so I tell patients that because they come in and their parents come in and they want to, have a medication, and you see it all the time. Patients with borderline personality disorder, especially into adulthood, the polypharmacy is so extensive. And I get it, they're relief seeking and providers are trying to provide that relief. But what we're often doing is actually making things a lot worse. A lot of patients will tell you, like, I can't tell you how many times I've had a patient come in, like in their mid-20s, and they say they got diagnosed with bipolar disorder. First it was depression, then it was bipolar disorder. And none of the medications helped me, and in fact, I actually think I felt worse on them. And it's like such a red flag for borderline personality disorder. Substance use disorder, so there's medication for opioid use disorder. And then ODD, treat the comorbidities that are probably more likely responsible for the symptoms that you're seeing. And then bipolar disorder, we use mood stabilizers. That's kind of quick and dirty medication. So psychological. So I think there are, 2 like really common modalities of therapy that we use for teenagers, regardless of what their etiology is, like regardless of what their diagnosis is. Most kids are going to benefit from either CBT or DBT. So CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy. And so that's really thinking about how our thoughts and feelings and behaviors are all connected. The example that I like to give is, say I have, and I tell this to patients sometimes because they're like, what the heck is this even going to do for me? If I had a snake in my hands and I presented it to Mary and Dr. Tweed, and the behavior we see is that Dr. Tweed runs out of the room and Mary leans in to me. I think we can break that down in a CBT model by thinking about, so the behavior is running out of the room or leaning in. What do we think the feeling is for Mary? She likes snakes, she's interested, she's intrigued. Yep. And then what about for Dr. Tweed? What's his feeling? Fear, right? But let's take that a step back to thoughts. So what's the thought? I hate snakes. Snakes are cool, right? And so that's like sometimes a real concrete way to explain to families that what we're trying to work on is that you have these thoughts that influence your feelings, that influence your behaviors, and then it all. And so kind of working on that is what the goal is there. And then dialectical behavioral therapy. This is like the gold standard for borderline personality disorder, but there are so many people that would benefit from this modality regardless of what their diagnosis is. I wish they taught this in home ec. I could have used this instead of learning how to make a pillow or like a wooden clock. So there, these 4 kind of tenets, so mindfulness, emotional regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. Like, man, those would be some really awesome skills to be giving any teenager. And then I think the other thing is just really fostering and enhancing a sense of competence. That is so important for teenagers. And often our teenagers that have severe emotional dysregulation, they are not getting enough opportunities to do this. And what really frustrates me is oftentimes kids' symptoms, they get called behaviors, their symptoms of their various conditions result in the consequence of losing access to the opportunities to enhance their competence. And so that is something that I try really hard to work on with parents or when I'm interfacing with anybody at the school, is like taking away their access to, their cosmetology class at school because they were misbehaving is, well, that's like taking away recess for a kid with ADHD. Like, it's just not effective. So extracurriculars, volunteering, vocational support. I've had so many teenagers that really, really struggle with this that have been able to find a part-time job, and they feel so much better about themselves, and they're being able to, demonstrate that sense of competence. So I think we really have to ask ourselves, like, what are we doing when we're punishing kids for these symptoms when we take away these opportunities? So social, so family work. There's some specific family therapy modalities. I'm sure I left some out. There are a couple of community-based therapies, so family-focused therapy, multi-systemic therapy. It's often hard to get the staff to do these kinds of modalities in the community. There's some basic like parent management training. I think like a lot of our BHIs in our pediatric clinics, the embedded social workers are trained in this and doing this with families. And then collaborative and proactive solutions, that's going back to Dr. Ross Green, the explosive child. And then I would say like anyone can treat the family. I think people get really nervous about this idea of like having to be a family therapist. You can be a family pediatrician. You can be a family psychiatrist. You don't have to be doing a specific family modality to be treating the family. In fact, I think sometimes psychoeducation alone can be helpful. So again, like I'll go back to the idea of lagging skills when we're talking about like consequences, and I'll say, sometimes I'm a little provocative. You have to know your audience, but a mentor taught me this, and you'll say like, if I said to you, if you can't recite the alphabet in Latin, I'm going to cut your foot off. Are you suddenly going to be capable of saying the alphabet in Latin? And they'd be, no, of course not. And I would say, in fact, you're probably less likely to be able to perform that task now because I've just cut your foot off, right? Which is incredibly distressing. Again, know your audience. Maybe you don't threaten to cut their foot off. Maybe you do something else. But it's kind of making this point that, and I know I said this before, but I cannot say it enough, that's just not an effective way to change behavior. It's just not. You cannot expect somebody to operate at a level of functioning or skills that they are not able to yet do by threatening to take things away. And we all know that stress performance curve. So when you're threatening kids to take things away, that their ability to use their skills to be emotionally regulated is even harder. And so, like go to the airport. My husband is always just like pulling me away from these situations. Go to the airport, kids having a tantrum, teenagers being disrespectful, and you hear the parent say, if you don't stop, we're not getting on this plane. And we are not going to Disney World. And I just want to be like, we all know you don't mean that, right? But the parent's desperate and the kid's out of control and everybody's staring at them and they're embarrassed. And so they just reach for whatever they can. But what you do when you parent that way on a regular basis is you've actually taught your kid that you don't mean what you say and you don't say what you mean. And that is so terrifying. And that is a great breeding grounds for kids to misbehave. And the same thing happens in schools. And my husband is just like, this isn't your circus, Kasey. Just move on. So school support. So I recognize that I'm incredibly privileged because I'm a psychiatric provider and I often have more time than primary care providers. But I try when I can to really collaborate with schools. And I know that that's not really feasible for a lot of people. But I think just being able to provide some psychoeducation for schools about the patient's symptoms and the most effective approach. And you'll notice, like, I don't say behaviors, I say symptoms. I really try to model strengths-based language, validating the school's need to maintain safety, right? The school itself and the staff are scared of some of these kids. They're scared. And they have a sense of feeling responsibility to keeping the other kids and the staff safe. And workplace violence is devastating. And it happens in hospitals with these kids in the emergency department. It happens in schools. It's awful. And so you can share with them that they can maintain safety and still be effective therapeutically. It's possible. Sometimes people, even professionals, get into that black and white thinking of you can't do both, and you really can. Advocating for the kid to be able to have access to social skills groups, and then participating in IEP meetings when able. I have some kids, I do not go to their IEP meetings. Their parents feel like the school is really supportive. They seem to be trauma informed. I don't need to attend those. There are some kids that I go to their IEP meetings because the parents are really, really struggling. There's a lot of conflict between the parent and the kid, and you can be a nice mediator to just say, hey, these are some of the things that I think might be helpful. What really breaks my heart is that depending on where you live, your school experience can be so variable, right? So you might be in a school setting where you've got a lot of really great support and you're surrounded by psychologically minded, school staff, and you're getting your needs met. And then you could live 2 towns over, and for whatever reason, the model there is more punitive, more consequences-based, not as trauma-informed. And your outcomes are going to be significantly different because as a teenager, you spend most of your time at school, right? And we know this, like population health studies show that your zip code is one of the biggest factors in your health outcomes, not just mental health. That's a bit of a tangent, but it really, really bothers me that is the case for our kids. Peers, again, friends are more important to adolescents than their families, and that's totally normal. And that's another area where kids lose access to their friends when they've had symptoms, right? Now, I get it. If your kid goes out with their best friend and robs liquor from the Shaws, the boundary is you don't get to spend time with that person for a period of time. And then maybe in order for you to see that person, it has to be supervised at our house, right? That is very different than you're never going to see that person again. But friends can also be a source of conflict and difficulty for adolescents, right? That's a huge, I've got some teenage girls and they come in and I'm like, what's going on? And they're like, drama. There's just so much drama. So an opportunity to practice skills, that's what adolescent relationships do, but sometimes it really pushes kids over the edge. So the goal is really to promote healthy and supportive relationships. All right, so kind of going along the theme of you can be both, you can be kind and firm. I really, really love this table because it talks about kind of parenting styles, but I think that this could be really applied to anyone who's interacting with teenagers, right? Or anyone who's interacting with anyone. Like I think about this in the context of even like my supervisory role, right? I think we've all probably had bosses that weren't in the green zone of this table, right? It doesn't help me perform. So the goal is to be kind and firm. So you're consistent, you're responsive, you're really considerate of the child's needs and preferences. You're not a pushover if you include the teenager in the decision making about what's going to work best for them. That's not like letting them get away with something, right? And then parents communicate their expectations and consequences clearly. So this again is say what you mean and mean what you say. In my house, the only way that you can lose treat is if you hurt someone else's body. That's it. That's the only way you can lose treat in the Moss household. There are times when my child drives me so crazy that I start to threaten treat. He has not hurt anyone. He is just driving me nuts. And I want it to stop. And I say, if you don't stop this, you are not getting a treat today. And he says, the only way to lose treat is if I hurt someone's body. And I'm like, you're right. And I'm reminded, right? Like, so he knows what the expectations are and the consequences are, right? And so then I say to him, my patience cup is about empty. I'm gonna lose it. Can we figure something out? Like, do you need to go outside? Do you need to get your wiggles out? Do you need a hug? Do you need to be alone? So that's kind and firm. And you can't do it 100% of the time. Like, I'm putting out kind of high expectations, right? Like, you can't do this 100% of the time. I don't. But this is a really, really effective way to be supportive and to really decrease the amount of emotional dysregulation that you're seeing. And you'll hear teenagers talk about the teachers that they really like. And oftentimes what they're describing is kind and firm. You would think maybe it's the permissive ones. That's not who they like. They want somebody. Teenagers want somebody who they can count on. You see this in the inpatient units all the time at Spring Harbor. The staff that are kind and firm are the ones where the kids have the least amount of emotional dysregulation. The ones that are trying to like be the kid's friend and are kind of willy-nilly and inconsistent, but they're super nice, they have a lot of codes on their shifts. The opposite of that is people who are incredibly harsh and firm. They have a lot of codes too. So this sweet spot is really where we want parents and teachers, anybody who interacts with teenagers to find. And it's not easy. So I've been talking for about an hour. It's time for our experiential learning. If you don't like kind of gooey sensory experiences, you can opt out of this. No one has to do this. But on your tables, you'll find pie plates with cornstarch. So there's only one for your table. It's right here. And then there's some water too. So I want you guys to pour your water into the pie plate. And you might need a little bit more water. The solo cups, the gold solo cups. We did a lot of experimenting last night. You might need more than 1 cup of water. Pour it all in there. Yep. And if you need a little bit more, it might need more. And then you start mixing it all together. And let me know when you've got a nice gooey mixture. I think we're going to need a little bit more water.
It's kind of a sensory treat, but not everybody's.
You guys are good. Sorry. All right. All right, great. So I'm going to explain why you guys are playing with oobleck right now. So I'm an osteopath. So I went to osteopathic medical school. And one of the first things we did was this experiment. And what they were actually talking about is learning how to do osteopathic manipulative medicine, where you're going to be touching people's bodies and moving their bodies around to really find the health. So does everyone know what fascia is? Yeah, so fascia is this amazing, it's my favorite body part. It's not the brain, it's actually fascia. Fascia is this amazing part of your body. It's like this saran wrap underneath your skin around like your muscles is the way that I describe it. And the reason why they had us do this exercise is they really wanted to highlight the fact that if you go into a treatment in a really hard, invasive way, the person's fascia is going to get like shrink wrap, and you're not going to find the health. You're not going to help facilitate health in your patient because it's going to slam right up, right? So what I want you guys to do with your pie plates is the goal is for you to get your fingertips to the bottom of the pie plate, and I want you to try first to just go in fast and hard and see what happens. You might have too much water. The cornstarch, what happens with the cornstarch? It's resistant. It's hard, right? Now try slowly easing your fingers into your mixture and see if you can get to the bottom of the pie plate. Does it work? Right? So your pie plate is your teenager. And the goal is to reach your teenager, which is the bottom of the pie plate. And when you come in hard and fast, what happens to your teenager? Right? So I will never forget doing that experiment in medical school. And I felt like, as I was doing it, I was like, this is, because I was like a geek. I was like such a psychiatry geek. Like I was just like, ooh, I'm going into psychiatry. I knew it a long time ago. So I was like, this is mental health. This is approaching our patients, right? And so if there's anything you can do to kind of share this experiment with anybody who works with teenagers, I think it's a really nice, effective way of showing that you can't come in fast and hard. You're not getting to the bottom of that pie plate, right? All right, so we're done with the experiential learning. So I'm going to leave you with this question. What if we treated our adolescents like toddlers? Some people might think that's not a good idea. It's kind of pejorative, right? But there are some similarities between toddlerhood and adolescence, right? They're so egocentric. I remember going to school, I had a pimple on my face, and I was just like, everyone is going to be looking at my pimple. No one was looking at my pimple. They were too busy being worried about their pimple. We're all like, they're so egocentric, right? They really desire autonomy. They want to be their own person. They want to make their decisions, right? They're seeking differentiation. This is hard. This is so hard. So I have a 2-year-old, and it is like physically hard for me. Maybe this says a lot more about me than you need to know, but like it is physically hard for me, and all 3 of my kids have done this, to realize like his developmental task is to realize that he and I are not the same person, but it's my developmental task as a mom to realize that too. And I was not prepared for that. And I've done it 3 times, and it is still so hard. We're not as much a dyad anymore. He's his own man. He's got his preferences, right? He says things like, go upstairs now. The same thing, and then they kind of come back to you a little bit in childhood, and then they do this again in adolescence, only in a much bigger way. My goodness, when I have teenagers, I'm going to have to really practice some skills. They want to be different than their parents. They want to have their own life and their own identity, and that's a wonderful thing. Some parents don't do well with that task, with that time. And they're both emotionally dysregulated, right? So when you see this toddler, anybody, I think, just goes, oh, right? Like, you're just like, oh, man. And the parent goes up to them, and they're like, oh, buddy, I'm so sorry that you tripped. I'm so sorry that you tripped. Let's brush your hands off. Here's a big hug. Let's wipe those tears. Next time, let's be a little bit more safe with our body. Why in the world do we somehow lose that approach when they're teenagers? Imagine you're the teenage girl and you tripped. You tripped up. You made a mistake, just like the little boy in the previous picture. And instead of your parent or your teacher or whoever is in your life saying, oh, I'm so sorry you tripped up. Let's do some problem solving around this. How can I support you in this? Our response is, go to your room. You're kicked out of school. Right? Why do we lose this? Why do we lose this with our grown-ups even, right? You're not a pushover to validate somebody's experience. You don't say, it's okay that you robbed the liquor store at Shaw's, right? But you can say, man, this is really tough. I'm so bummed for you. I'm so bummed for you. You broke curfew, and now you're not going to be able to go to the football game next weekend. I'm really sorry. I'm here for you. Why can't we do this with our teenagers? Why is this so hard? And that's it. All right.
Can you talk a little bit more about the social skills groups and how you do those, and just explain
Yep. Yeah, sure. So the question was just talking a little bit about social skills groups. So that was in the context of advocating for kids in the school setting. I would love to have social skills groups. Maybe someday we will at NBH, that would be amazing. But social skills groups are really in the setting of the school, with the school clinician that's able to take some of the kids that are struggling, and maybe some of the kids who aren't, right, who can model a little bit more, and really working on some of those social skills that they struggle with in the school setting.
I'm Mary Kuhnert. I work at Brunswick High as a special ed social worker, and I work closely also with my speech and language pathologist, and we often do social skills groups together. And we find like there's different parts of social skills that people are developing, so we try to put them together so that they're all working on the same skill. But you know, oftentimes it could look pretty simple, like we're playing Uno, right? And just sort of how to win, how to lose, how to share, those kind of things. Yeah, so it's pretty good. I think the challenge in high school often is finding kids that you know, are sort of more typical to join the groups. And I think scheduling is really hard also because there's so many different classes and opportunities and different colored days. And but when we get it together, it's really great. I feel like it's a really good skill.
Mary, are those groups that sort of self-refer within the high school, or if we had somebody who we thought maybe would benefit, is that something we could sort of reach out? Just thinking about that interface between the medical office and the school.
Mm-hmm. So they would have to have an IEP
yeah.
to get it through special ed, and to have that on your IEP, you'd have to have a deficit in some sort of skill that is a goal on the IEP.
So potentially another plug to participate in those IEPs.
Yes. Yeah.
My first question is, what happened to intermittent explosive disorder? I never liked the diagnosis myself, but I think it's still up there, right?
Yeah.
You see that?
Some people's charts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's one question.
That probably should have been on.
Okay. I mean, I think
Intermittent,
it's another
yeah.
one. It's probably there's trauma and other.
Yeah, yeah, and then, so I think that's probably a reflection more of just like my style and my training is that I think what we were seeing is, you know, what our meeting criteria for intermittent explosive disorder are often better explained by other conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
My second question is, when sometimes when you're looking at these kids, they've come into the emergency room because they're completely out of control or pressed or violence. Is there a starting point that you see, or how do you, like, there's so many issues usually at that point? Obviously creating safety or some calmness, behavioral control, but do you have a sort of way of approaching those situations?
When they come into the emergency department
When
really
it's got
dysregulated.
that acute.
Yeah, I think what is often kind of counterintuitive in those situations is removing the parent. So I've had a lot of situations where the kids are really out of control, and the parent is often exacerbating the dysregulation. And again, they're not doing it on purpose, but the dynamic with the parent is sometimes the reason why they're in there to begin with. And so being able to say, and I've done this when I was doing shifts in the ER, it seems like maybe it would be a good idea for everyone to just take a little bit of space, and is there a waiting area that the parent can go to? That's usually one of the first things that I do. If that doesn't help and the kid gets more dysregulated, then we bring the parent back in, right? But that's sometimes often a really easy first step. And you can be curious because the parent's already feeling really ashamed and really heightened. And just say, I wonder if it would be helpful if everybody just kind of took space here for a minute. So then that can be, the thing that can be helpful. And then again, just it's that going back to the kind and firm, I think any staff that are interacting with these kids, being able to just say, remove the personal part out of it. Like I think a lot of kids struggle with, like you go into the ER and maybe now you can't have access to your drawstring sweatpants and you're in these like paper scrubs and then you don't have your cell phone, right? Like being able to just say like, I know this is a real bummer. Like this is just our policy. We're just trying to keep everybody safe, as opposed to coming into it fast and hard, like with the cornstarch, and saying, all right, it's time for you to change. Give me your cell phone, da 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 da. And that's hard to do, like in the ER, especially. Like I think staff are used to being like, let's go, right? But just kind of slowing it down, and that approach can be really helpful too. And then there are times, unfortunately, where kids are so out of control that they need medication to help them calm down, and it's awful. So I would say, like for those of you who work in the emergency department, like if you could do a dissolvable, Zyprexa to make sure that they get what they need, as opposed to like having to IM a teenager or any human being, but particularly our kids, is so traumatic for them and for the staff involved.
Yeah, your comments about the different types of parenting and how to get to kind and firm raises. The question is what your thoughts are. Is this working?
Yeah.
About the mental state of parents and what lets me be kind and firm as opposed to be harsh or disengaged or overreactive. And sometimes that kind of moves us to having to be considering, my topic is the kid, but now a parent who seems to be struggling, and that is coming out in them being anything but kind and firm.
Yeah, great question. And again, I think back on my own parenting. I am my best self as a parent when I am the most resourced, right? I think back to my first son when I was in residency and my husband was in residency. There were not great times when we were parenting in that state of overnight shifts and not seeing each other. And now we're older, we have more skills, we have more money, we can get babysitters, we have more family nearby, right? And so your point is well taken, that not everybody has access to the resources that help them be their best version of themselves as a parent. Often what I do is try to meet people where they're at, and really highlight that everybody is trying to do the best they can. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to be a not great parent, right? And so sometimes the best thing you can do is actually have a parent-only session where the kid's out of the room, and you can just say, hey, this doesn't seem like it's going really well. I'm here to support you. Validate how hard it is for them. Recognize that they might have other mental health conditions that also have cognitive rigidity and dysregulation. But oftentimes a great way to get to parents is to ask them about the relationship that they had with their own parents. And sometimes that's an opportunity where people will say things like, man, my parents were tough. They were so tough. My childhood was really, really awful. And I promised myself that I was going to be a different parent, and I'm doing the same things that they're doing. And you normalize that of course that's what you're doing. That was what was modeled for you. And that's your in to say, it sounds like you really want to do things differently. I can help you with that. And it's not going to change overnight, and it's going to be small amounts, right? And I think just normalizing that we weren't, like, it's so interesting. So next week I'm doing a presentation for peds on supporting postpartum parents. And one of the things I'm going to highlight is we were never supposed to do this in isolation. Like, we were not supposed to parent in isolation. And I think we're seeing a lot of the negative consequences of that, right? Because our parents are just feeling overwhelmed and isolated and poorly resourced. And how could that not lead to ineffective parenting? But we have this culture of isolationism in this country where we're just supposed to like do it on our own, and it's so to the detriment of our community and to our kids. So I think I talk to parents about that. I say, like, you weren't supposed to do this by yourself. Like, of course this is really hard. And really just meeting people where they're at, because the last thing you want to do is shame or alienate a parent about how things are going.
So I was interested to hear that you attend IEPs. I haven't managed to do that. I don't know if I can. Just some maybe hints or anything you found is most useful when you've attended those IEPs, and perhaps a way to be more useful. As a psychiatrist myself, I generally rely on the case managers to advocate, and perhaps there's another angle that you can enlighten me that I could be even more helpful.
Yeah. So I feel I feel really lucky, because before I was a physician, I was in ed tech. So I attended a lot of IEP meetings in my prior role. And so I think they're really intimidating, and it's really hard to know, like, they're very formal, you know, like there's like a legal form that you go through and everybody takes a turn. And I think that has absolutely helped me as a psychiatrist, having had that experience in the past. But I think oftentimes the staff really want to hear from you. Like, there's this privilege and power of being the doctor, right? It's not necessarily fair. You could say the same exact thing that a case manager would say, and for whatever reason, like, they're hearing it more because you're saying it. So, you know, I think most of the time there's an opportunity where they just say, and sometimes they'll even say, let's start with Dr. Moss, because we know that she can't stay for the 90-minute meeting we're about to have, right? And so I just kind of start off by saying, like, these are some of the things I'm noticing. These are some of the things I think might be helpful in the school setting. You don't want to go into it and say, this is what I think you should do, because then you've got your cornstarch and the pie plate experiment going, and that school staff is going to harden, right? So I think just going into it and saying, being curious, like, I think this might be helpful. I want to learn a bit more about what symptoms look like in the school setting, and oftentimes they're really receptive to that. Sometimes not so much, and so you have to be a little bit more assertive to say, hey, like, I really would like to be able to explain what I'm seeing, what my concerns are, and I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about, you know, X, Y, Z. But I would say most of the time they're really receptive. It's hard. It's really, really hard to find the time to go. They're virtual most of the time, which is really nice. But it is like the stars kind of have to align, I think, for you to be able to attend, because they just need 7 days to schedule them. They try to do that, you know, sooner than that, but so it's not easy. Yeah.
Is it okay if I'm
Yeah, of course.
This is just for Brunswick, but we've had a lot of success with having providers come to staffing as opposed to IEPs, because they're a little more casual and they can be a lot more flexible in scheduling and stuff, and can also be virtual.
Is the staffing about a particular job?
Yeah, so a staffing would be an informal IEP, so it would be about one student, and we try to get all their teachers and providers. It's like a wraparound meeting, basically, opposed to an IEP, where an IEP would be a schedule change in the student's programming, opposed to a staffing, which could be a schedule change. Then we have an IEP to do that, and just to problem solve, really, is what a staffing is.
Well, this isn't a question, but just an agreement, I guess. No, I was struck by when you were saying that so many parents, their main way of behavior change, or that they fall into, not that they start, but that they fall into, is really not just consequences, but only negative consequences, 100% negative consequences. Actually, a long time ago, since you know, that Doug probably read this stuff too, but there was these folks at the Oregon Social Learning Center, and you know, they were actually kind of were the folks who got parent management training going, and they would follow families around with these large video cams and just kind of learn about how these patterns developed. And one of their models, this was Gerald Patterson back in the day, it's kind of a negative reinforcement cycle, you know? So it's kind of escalating negative reinforcement. So negative reinforcement, if the fire alarm goes off and we do something to get it to stop, then that gets reinforced. So, you know, maybe the parent says, you know, Henry, you know, please pick up your toys, and it doesn't happen, and they're not that skilled about it. They say, Henry, pick up your toys, and all of a sudden Henry picks up his toys, and so that you know that reinforces the thing of yelling on the parent, and so then the parent does it the next time, and Henry says no, throws the toy back, and then that gets the parent to go. So it's this kind of escalating thing. So, you know, I had the opportunity a while ago to listen to MATCH supervision, you know, MATCH being, you know, having a number of evidence-based practice, including for, you know, hard time following directions. They almost, the whole thing of net timeout by reinforcement was at the end. 50% of the time they never got there because the child was cured. You know, because it's so hard, as you point out. All the you pointed out that all the child hears is basically negative feedback, and the parents get so frustrated that the only thing they're saying is, you know, is negative things. So there's this huge effort to get the parent to do basically special time, where they don't give any directions, and they just spend time with their child, which they've so much gotten out of, and they get a whole bunch of, you know, improvement out of that, and then of course they you know, to your point, you know, instead of having them teach Latin, you know, they, I don't know, do something they can do,
Right.
make a direction on something they can do, and then of course Latin is reinforcement, and kind of grow it like that, like a tender shoot. But then sometimes you see those books. Isn't it 1, 2, 3 Magic? I think is I think a predominantly negative consequence. You know, just we're going to start with a timeout.
Yeah.
So, which, as you point out, if you just do a timeout, if you just go right there. I mean, if you really think our explosive outbursts are really not explosive enough, you really need to amp this up.
Right.
That's a great way to go.
Right.
And,
I think it's hard too because it's not intuitive. The other night.
It's not natural.
It's not natural.
It's not the natural
It's
thing
not.
to do.
It's not.
I'm going to start doing
Yes.
special time, right?
Yeah. I'll give a quick example. So I have a 5-year-old and he has autism, and so he's not always aware of what's going on related to safety. But he really, really wants to be able to go farther away from us on his bike, just like his big brother. So we're on the bike path in Brunswick, and I see him, and he's going, and we've told him the expectation is that you can stay where where we can see you, right? But he doesn't really have the theory of mind to think about what we can see, because he's only thinking about what he can see. So he goes barreling around this corner. We can't see him. My husband's running. He's yelling his name, you know. Luckily, my oldest loves to rise to the occasion, and he's on his bike. So he's like, I'll go get him. So he's biking, and he gets him, and he comes back. My husband's all stressed out, and he's about to say, we're all done biking. And I'm like, let's just give this another go. So we say to him, that part of the bridge and then this part of the path is where you're allowed to be. If you go beyond that, we're leaving, right? So I see him take off with his little bike, and he goes right to the edge, and he looks back at us, and he kind of smiles, and he turns around, and he comes back to us. And I'm hitting my husband, reinforce it. So he runs down and is just like, good job, that's exactly what you were supposed to do, that's the edge of the line, right? But my husband is not a child psychiatrist who used to be an ed tech, right? And so it's not natural to him to be like, yes, because he's like, why should, that was the expectation, right? Like, that's the expectation, is just like, yeah, good job, you did what we asked you to do, right? But no, because that's actually a really hard skill for our son. And so we had a party for him about that, and then he just went back and forth at that one part. But it's not intuitive for parents, and parents are exhausted. They're like, I don't have to throw a party every time they do what I expect them to do. But if you want them to behave safely, it's, you know, and what is it any skin off your back to verbally reinforce someone? No, but it's a lot of mental energy to be thinking about that, right? So I have a lot of executive functioning skills. So I'm the executive functioner I'm chief executive functioner for the Moss household, right? And that can be exhausting, so. But it's really effective, because then after that, Wells did not bike where we couldn't see him, and he stayed safe, and he had a blast and felt very competent, so, yeah.
Thanks, Kasey. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I've been thinking a lot about the Surgeon General's report about parents in context of our work, and how much of the time I spend with my kids where I'm really thinking about their parents. And I'm trying to sort of figure out what to do with the level of information about parental fatigue, going to your point about the exhaustion of it. Something that stood out to me from the report was the idea that a stay-at-home mother spends more time with her kids, or a working mother spends more time with her kids than a stay-at-home mother did in the 70s. And we're still seeing, rises and increases in all this behavior. And I'm still trying to figure out, how to make sense of it all. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that report or how this might impact our work.
Yeah. I think of it in kind of like a micro level and then like a macro level, right? So I think kind of micro is like you do the best you can with the people that are sitting in front of you. Like share that information, right, with them. Normalize how hard it is to parent. But I then think that and this is tricky, because we get told that we're not supposed to be like political, right? And I don't know how we can do this work and not be. And so I think that there are opportunities for us to engage in more advocacy. But again, that takes time, and that is a privilege and a luxury, right? To use our voice as mental health professionals to influence larger policy, either at a state level or at a federal level. And that is really, really hard to do, and I'm still trying to figure that out. I think maybe, Dr. Tweed can speak to that a little bit more, but I think we do have an obligation to say, I can only do so much with this caseload that I have, with this one person we have in front of me. But when there are opportunities to be influencing some of the policies that really affect our families, I think we really have to be doing that. And I wonder if there's a way for us to do that better. Sometimes like an email will go out kind of last minute to say, hey, they're going to be talking about this, you want to give testimony, and it's not often enough time for people to really participate in, and you have to write a written testimony, and that takes time. But maybe as an institution we could say we really want to devote more time and resources to being more effective in that way.
I'm Callie McMahon. I'm one of the PAs that works in the emergency department, and I take care of a lot of our BH patients. In terms of advocacy, and I also was curious about talking to you about the anxious generation. Really interesting book that came out last year, and I think had some really poignant information about social media and smartphone access. There's not an adolescent I don't take care of in the ER that's there for something to do with their phone or access to technology or some drama on social media. And so in terms of advocacy, how do you see us as mental health providers instigating change in how our adolescents kind of operate and don't operate well with technology and social media? Light question.
I don't know. I think it's, I feel so overwhelmed by it when I'm trying to talk to people about decreasing their use. I feel like similar to trying to talk to people about not using cannabis or using less cannabis. I think it's really, a lot of studies show that kids' behavior is dependent on parental use of devices. And so again, trying to talk with their parents about kind of modeling in a proactive way, nipping it in the bud with parents of young kids. But yeah, I think opportunities maybe to talk with schools too. I know that Morris High School just enacted this school year not being able to have access to their cell phones during the school year, and I think that is fantastic. And I bet they're going to find their kids are more engaged and learning more, although probably really anxious to begin with. And so I don't know, having other schools kind of start to enact some of those policies as well. But yeah, it's such a problem, that pervasive contact, and the fact that I had to stop using Instagram this spring because for some reason the algorithm was just constantly sending me really, really traumatic content, and I don't know how that happened. Like, I wasn't looking for it, and then I must have just like looked at one thing, and then it was just like everything. And so the fact that it changes based on, so if you're in a really hard time and you're like looking up content, you know, about mental health conditions, like your algorithm might change to be a lot of really awful, activating misinformation. And so you all know this. I don't know. That's not a solution, but it's really, really problematic. Yeah. So I think of using it as thinking of like kind of harm reduction, right? Like similar to what we do with substances, just try to meet people where they're at and could they decrease use. And I don't think it's about quantity, it's about quality. It's about what is the type of content that you really are exposing yourself to. There was a study that just came out, I was looking at it last night, and it was saying that just 2 weeks, teenagers with just 2 weeks of a break of social media found improvement in their mental health symptoms. And so maybe that's a way to say, like, what if you could just try it for a short period of time and see how you do? Yeah.
I'll just add on to that briefly. This is not about adolescence, but I now look at wellness research, and it's hard to talk to providers and nurses about wellness when they're burned out, because they're burned out and they're but there's some research, most of the research is now done on medical students, and they look at a variety of stress markers and talk to them in the professional seminar classes. And one of the stress markers is increased screen time. So they are looking at that as a stress marker.
Thank you all for coming. And this is the last program for this year. Thank you very much, Dr. Moss. That was really awesome.